She was just 6 years old when she gave away the only thing keeping her alive. Imagine a little girl facing a brutal winter storm, making a choice that would change everything. The winter wind cut through the wooden walls like a blade, and little Lily Mae Whitmore clutched her faded blue blanket tighter around her small shoulders. But when she saw that tiny native baby turning blue in his mother's desperate arms, something inside her 6-year-old heart made a choice that would shock the world. Can you guess what happened next? Stay with us on Narrative Odyssey to find out. The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, trapping everyone in the small trading post at the edge of nowhere. Samuel Whitmore paced near the fireplace, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he watched the snow pile higher against the windows. His wife, Eleanor, sat on a wooden crate, trying to keep their daughter warm with what little heat the struggling fire could provide. Through the frosted glass, they could see the small group of natives who had taken shelter under the building's overhang. The tribal woman held her baby close, but even from inside, they could see the child wasn't moving much. The little one's lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and his mother's face showed the kind of desperation that transcends language. Lily Mae pressed her small face against the cold window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched. The baby looked so still, so quiet. She thought about how cold she felt, even with her blanket, and imagined how much colder that little baby must be, with nothing but thin cloth wrapped around him. "Mama," she whispered, tugging on Elena's worn dress. "That baby is freezing." Elena glanced toward the window, and her heart clenched. She had seen that look before. A mother watching her child slip away, powerless to stop it. But Samuel had made it clear they couldn't afford to get involved with the natives. "Too risky," he said. "Too complicated." "I know, sweet girl," Elena whispered back, pulling Lily Mae closer. "But there's nothing we can do." But Lily Mae kept staring at that baby. She watched as the native woman tried to shelter him with her own body, breathing on his tiny hands to warm them. The little one's cries had grown weaker throughout the day, and now he barely made any sound at all. Samuel moved to the window and drew the curtain shut with a sharp tug. "Stop looking," he said firmly. "We have our own family to worry about." Lily Mae felt her father's fear, but she also felt something else, something that made her chest tight and her eyes burn. She looked down at her blue blanket, the one her grandmother had made before she died, the one that smelled like home and safety. What would you do in a moment like this? Keep watching Narrative Odyssey to see how one small act sparked a chain of events no one could predict. The trading post owner, a gruff man named Morrison, had already made it clear that the natives weren't welcome inside. They could wait out the storm under his roof's edge, but that was all the charity he was willing to extend. He muttered something about not wanting trouble with either side. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. Lily Mae could hear the wind howling like something alive and angry. She pulled her blanket up to her chin and tried to sleep on the hard floor where her family had laid out their bedrolls. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that baby's blue lips, heard his weak cries growing quieter and quieter. In the darkness, she could hear her parents whispering urgently to each other. Her father's voice was tight with worry, her mother's soft, with something that sounded like prayer. They were scared too, she realized. Scared of the storm, scared of running out of food, scared of what might happen if they didn't make it to the next town before their supplies ran out. Lily Mae rolled over and listened to the wind. Somewhere out there, just a few feet away through the wall, a baby was dying. A baby who looked different from her, whose mother spoke words she couldn't understand, but who was just as cold and just as helpless as she was. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake her parents. Through a crack in the curtain, she could see the faint outline of the native woman, still holding her baby, still trying to keep him warm with nothing but her own body heat. That's when Lily Mae made the choice that would test everything her family believed about survival. trust, and what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to freeze the kindness right out of people's hearts. But what she was about to do would set in motion events that none of them could have imagined. And the response from the tribal people would challenge everything the settlers thought they knew about the people they called strangers. Lily May slipped out from under her blanket like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The trading post was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her parents slept fitfully nearby, her father's arm protectively draped over her mother's shoulder. She crept toward the door, her precious blue blanket clutched against her chest. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure it would wake everyone. But the sound of the howling wind covered her movement. The heavy wooden door was cold to the touch, and she had to use both hands to lift the iron latch without making noise. The moment she opened the door, the freezing air hit her like a physical blow. Snow immediately began to sting her face and hands, but she pushed forward anyway. There, huddled against the building's wall under a small overhang, sat the native woman with her baby. The woman looked up in surprise when she saw the small figure approaching through the snow. Her dark eyes were filled with exhaustion and fear, but also a fierce protectiveness that reminded Lily May of her own mother. The baby in her arms was so still, it was terrifying. Lily May approached slowly, the way her father had taught her to approach scared animals. She held out her blanket with both hands, her small voice barely audible over the wind. The woman stared at her, confusion and weariness mixing in her expression. Without saying a word, Lily May stepped closer and gently laid her blanket over the baby. The soft blue fabric immediately began to cover the tiny form, and the woman's eyes widened in shock. She looked from the blanket to the little girl's face, searching for some kind of trick or trap. But Lily May just smiled through her chattering teeth and pointed to the baby, then to the blanket. The universal language of a child's gesture needed no translation. The woman's face transformed, tears beginning to fall as she pulled the blanket tighter around her child. "Lily May," her father's voice cut through the storm like a whip crack. She turned to see Samuel standing in the doorway, his face a mask of horror and anger. Behind him, Elena had woken and was struggling to understand what was happening. "Get away from them now." Samuel's voice carried a fear that made Lily May's stomach drop. But she didn't move. She couldn't. The baby's color was already starting to improve under her blanket, and the native woman was holding him closer, whispering what sounded like prayers in her own language. Samuel lunged forward through the snow, but Elena caught his arm. "Samuel, wait. Look." The native woman was speaking now, soft words that none of them understood, but that carried the unmistakable sound of gratitude. She lifted the baby slightly, showing them how the warmth was already helping. The child's breathing seemed steadier, his lips less frighteningly blue. Morrison appeared in the doorway, awakened by the commotion. "What in hell is going on out here?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw the scene. "Let's get that child inside before she freezes to death." And to the native woman, he pointed. "Keep to your own business." But something had shifted in those few moments under the storm. The woman met Samuel's eyes directly, her own filled with a mixture of desperate gratitude and fierce dignity. She spoke again, her voice stronger now, and though they couldn't understand her words, they could hear the emotion behind them. Lily May was shivering violently now, her thin nightgown no protection against the brutal cold. Elena rushed forward and scooped her daughter into her arms, carrying her back toward the warmth of the trading post. But Lily May kept looking back over her mother's shoulder at the woman and baby. Inside, Eleanor wrapped her daughter in Samuel's coat and held her close to the fire. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, though her voice held more wonder than anger. "You could have frozen to death out there." Samuel paced angrily, running his hands through his hair. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, though his voice was gentler than before. That blanket was the only warm covering we had for you." And now, he gestured helplessly toward the door. But Lily May wasn't listening to his worries about practicality. She was thinking about how the baby's face had changed when the blanket covered him, how his mother's tears had looked different than the tears of sadness she'd been crying before. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but something else was happening too. They could hear voices now, speaking in the native language. More than just the woman's voice. Other people had appeared in the storm, though where they had come from in this weather was a mystery. Morrison moved to the window and peered out through the frost. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Looks like the whole tribe showed up." Samuel joined him at the window, his face growing pale. In the swirling snow, they could see shapes moving, dark figures on horseback, appearing like phantoms through the storm. At least a dozen of them, maybe more, all converging on the trading post. Elena pulled Lily May closer, her heart racing. Had her daughter's kindness just put them all in terrible danger? Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, and Morrison was already reaching for his shotgun. But the native woman outside was calling out to the approaching figures, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. She was holding up the blue blanket, showing it to them, speaking rapidly in words that sounded urgent and important. What none of the settlers inside could know was that word of. The little girl's gift had already reached the tribal camp through methods they didn't understand. And what was approaching through the storm wasn't a war party, but something far more significant, something that would turn their assumptions about friendship, enemies, and the true meaning of survival completely upside down. The riders dismounted in silence, their figures materializing from the storm, like spirits made flesh. Samuel gripped his rifle tighter, but something in the way they moved made him hesitate. There was no aggression in their approach, no weapons drawn. Instead, they formed a respectful circle around the woman and her baby. An older man stepped forward, his long gray hair whipping in the wind. Even through the storm, his presence commanded attention. He spoke to the woman in their shared language, his voice deep and measured. She responded quickly, holding up Lily May's blue blanket and pointing toward the trading post. Morrison cursed under his breath. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Now we've got a whole war party on our doorstep because your daughter couldn't mind her own business." But Eleanor was watching the scene more carefully. "Look at them, Samuel. Really look. Does that seem like a war party to you?" She was right. The riders weren't arranged for battle. Instead, they seemed to be protecting the woman and child, creating a windbreak with their horses and bodies. Several of them had dismounted and were sharing their own blankets and furs, building a more effective shelter. The gray-haired man approached the trading post door, slowly, his hands visible and empty. When he reached the entrance, he stopped and called out in heavily accented English, "We wish to speak with the child who gave warmth to our blood." Morrison looked ready to refuse, but Samuel surprised everyone by stepping forward. "She's just a little girl," he called back through the door. "She didn't know what she was doing." "She knew exactly what she was doing," came the reply. "May we enter?" The storm speaks too loudly for proper words. The question hung in the air like ice crystals. Morrison shook his head vigorously, but Eleanor was already moving toward the door. "Samuel, that baby could have died. Our daughter may have saved his life. And now what?" Samuel demanded. "They come for repayment? They take her as payment. We don't know what they want." But Lily May wriggled out of her mother's arms and walked to the door. Despite her father's protests, she reached up and began to lift the latch. The adults were too stunned to stop her. Before she had opened the door wide, the gray-haired man looked down at her, his weathered face serious but kind. Behind him, the woman with the baby stepped forward, the child now wrapped securely in the blue blanket. The baby's color had returned to normal, and he was making soft sounds that spoke of comfort rather than distress. "You are very small to carry such a large heart." the man said to Lily May, his English, careful but clear. The woman spoke rapidly to the man, gesturing between Lily May and her baby. The man nodded gravely, then looked back at the little girl. Ayana says you saw her son dying and chose to save him with your own warmth. She says you gave away your protection from the cold to protect someone you had never met. Lily May nodded solemnly, though she was shivering in the doorway. He looked scared. She said simply. The man translated her words, and something rippled through the group of natives. Several of them exchanged glances that seemed to carry deep meanings. The grey-haired man knelt down to Lily May's eye level. In our ways, such a gift carries great weight. When one saves the life of another, especially the life of a child, debts are created that must be honoured. Samuel stepped protectively beside his daughter. She doesn't want anything in return. She's just a child who didn't understand the consequences. The man stood slowly, his eyes moving from Samuel to Eleanor to Lily May. Understanding and consequences are different things. What your daughter did tonight will be remembered for many generations. But first, the immediate debt must be paid. He gestured to his people, and several of them began moving toward their horses. Samuel tensed, his hand moving back toward his rifle. But what happened next defied every expectation he had about how this encounter would unfold, because what the tribal people were preparing to do would challenge everything the settlers believed about generosity, honor, and the true meaning of reciprocity. In a land where survival often meant choosing between yourself and a stranger, the tribal people began unpacking bundles from their horses. Moving with quiet efficiency, despite the storm, Samuel watched in growing confusion as they produced items that seemed impossible to have in such harsh conditions. Thick furs, dried meat, what looked like medicinal herbs, and, most surprisingly, a beautifully woven blanket that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. The grey-haired man, who the others clearly treated as a leader, directed the activities with subtle gestures. He spoke again to Samuel, his voice carrying over the wind. I am Takakota. What your daughter did tonight cannot go unanswered. In our ways, a life debt must be honored immediately. We don't want anything, Samuel said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. She gave the blanket freely. Freely given, freely returned, Takakota replied, but with interest. As honor demands, Ayana, the young mother, approached with her baby still wrapped in Lily May's blue blanket. She spoke to Takakota in their language, her words urgent and emotional. The other tribal members listened intently, several nodding with what appeared to be approval. Takakota turned back to the settlers. Ayana wishes to speak, but her English is limited. She asked me to tell you that your daughter did not just save her son from the cold. She saved him from death itself. The child was slipping away, and without warmth, he would not have seen another sunrise. Elena gasped softly, pulling Lily May closer. The weight of what her daughter had done was becoming clear. This hadn't been just a kind gesture. It had been a matter of life and death. She asks also that you understand something else. Takakota continued. The baby your daughter saved is not just any child. He is the grandson of our eldest medicine woman, the great-grandson of a chief whose bloodline stretches back 7 generations. Your daughter saved not just a life, but a legacy. Morrison, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. That's all very touching, but we're in the middle of a blizzard. Can't this wait until the storm passes? Takakota's eyes fixed on Morrison with a stare that made the trading post owner take a step back. Honor cannot wait for convenient weather. A debt of this magnitude demands immediate response. The tribal people had finished unpacking their bundles and were now arranging items in the snow near the trading post entrance. Despite the wind and cold, they worked with careful precision, creating what looked almost like a formal display. We offer these gifts not as payment, for no payment could equal what was given. Takakota explained. We offer them as recognition of the heart that beats in such a small chest. He gestured to the arranged items. Furs to keep the child warm for many winters. Food to sustain her family through harsh times. Medicine to protect her from illness. And this, he lifted the shimmering blanket, was woven by our eldest grandmother, made from the wool of sheep that graze in the high meadows where the spirits walk. It carries blessings that will protect your daughter for all her days. Lily May stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder at the beautiful blanket. It seemed to catch light from sources that didn't exist, and even in the storm, it appeared to glow with its own inner warmth. But Samuel remained suspicious. Why would you give so much for one blanket? What do you really want from us? Takakota's expression grew serious. You do not understand the weight of what happened here tonight. Your daughter looked at a dying child from a different people, with different ways, different words, different skin, and saw not a stranger, but a soul in need. In a world that teaches fear of the different, she chose love. The wind seemed to quiet for a moment, as if even the storm was listening to his words. Such hearts are rare in any people, Takakota continued. They must be honored, protected, nurtured. What we give tonight is not payment, but recognition of something sacred. Eleanor found herself moved to tears, understanding finally that they were witnessing something profound. This wasn't just about the exchange of goods or even the saving of a life. This was about the recognition of a spirit that transcended the boundaries that usually divided people. But as Takakota reached to hand the precious blanket to Lily May, another voice cut through the night, a harsh, angry voice that carried the sound of approaching horses and the promise of violence. Well, well, looks like we got ourselves a little Indian-loving party here. Everyone turned to see a group of rough-looking men emerging from the storm, their faces hard with the kind of hatred that had been poisoning the frontier for generations. And the leader of this group was looking at Lily May and her family with the kind of smile that promised nothing but trouble, because sometimes, when two worlds try to bridge their differences, there are always those who profit from keeping them apart. And they were about to discover just how far some people would go to preserve the hatred that divided the land. The newcomers rode through the storm like harbingers of violence. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes and a sneer that spoke of years spent hating anything different from himself. Behind him rode 4 others, all armed, all carrying the same expression of barely contained aggression. "Name's Garrett," the leader called out, not bothering to dismount. "We heard tell there was some Indian trouble brewing at Morrison's place. Looks like we arrived just in time." Morrison stepped forward nervously. "There's no trouble here, Garrett. Just folks waiting out the storm." Garrett's laugh was like broken glass. "No trouble. I see a whole pack of savages surrounding white folks. And that looks like plenty of trouble to me." His eyes fixed on the gifts arranged in the snow. "Looks like they're trying to buy something. Question is, what?" Takakota remained perfectly still, but Samuel could see the subtle way the other tribal members shifted their positions. They weren't preparing to attack, but they were definitely preparing to defend. "They're not buying anything," Samuel said, stepping protectively in front of his family. "My daughter helped their child, and they're showing gratitude." Helped their child. Garrett spat in the snow. "You mean your little girl got herself involved with Indian business? That's not helping, friend. That's asking for trouble." Lily May, still clutching her mother's hand, looked up at the angry man with confusion. She couldn't understand why someone would be upset about helping a baby who was cold. Ayana, sensing the danger, pulled her infant closer and spoke urgently to Takakota in their language. The old leader's expression darkened as he replied, but his voice remained calm and measured. "We seek no conflict," Takakota said to Garrett. "We came only to honor a debt and return kindness with kindness." "Debt?" Garrett laughed again. only debt Indians understand is the one they owe for all the trouble they've caused. And the only payment worth taking is them getting as far away from decent folks as possible. One of Garrett's men spoke up. Maybe we should teach these savages what happens when they get too comfortable around white settlements. The tension in the air became electric. Samuel could feel it building like pressure. Before lightning strikes, Elena pulled Lily Mae behind her, while Morrison backed toward his door, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. But it was Lily Mae who broke the standoff. She stepped out from behind her mother and walked directly toward Garrett's horse, her small voice cutting through the wind and hatred like a bell. "Why are you so angry?" she asked, looking up at him with genuine curiosity. They just wanted to say thank you for helping their baby. Garrett stared down at her, clearly not expecting such a direct question from a child. For a moment, his sneer faltered, replaced by something that might have been confusion. "Get back, little girl," he said, but his voice had lost some of its venom. "This isn't children's business." "But it started with children's business," Lily Mae replied. "Their baby was cold, so I gave him my blanket. Now they want to give me a blanket too. That seems fair." The simplicity of her logic hung in the air, like a challenge to all the complicated hatred that had brought Garrett and his men through the storm. Here was a 6-year-old child, reducing their conflict to its most basic elements. Someone was cold, someone else helped, and now help was being offered in return. Takakota watched this exchange with growing intensity, his eyes moving between the innocent child and the men who represented everything that made peace between their people so difficult. "Your daughter speaks wisdom that shames grown men," he said quietly to Samuel. "Perhaps it is time for the children to teach the adults." But Garrett's confusion was rapidly being replaced by something darker, and the way his hand moved toward his weapon suggested that he wasn't interested in lessons from children or wisdom from anyone, because some people choose hatred so completely that even the innocence of a child becomes a threat to the darkness they've built their lives around. Garrett's hand hovered near his weapon, but something in Lily Mae's fearless gaze seemed to freeze him in place. The other settlers and tribal members watched in tense silence as a 6-year-old girl faced down a man whose reputation for violence stretched across 3 territories. "You know what I think?" Lily Mae continued, completely unaware of the danger she was in. "I think you're cold too, and when people get really cold, sometimes they get angry. Instead of asking for help, the words hit Garrett like a physical blow. His scarred face twisted with emotions he clearly didn't want to feel. Behind him, his men shifted nervously, uncertain how to respond to a child who was treating their leader like any other person in need of understanding. Elena stepped forward to retrieve her daughter, but Takakota raised a subtle hand, stopping her. The old leader was watching something unfold that he recognized as significant beyond the immediate moment. "That's enough wisdom from children," Garrett snarled, his anger returning. "You people need to pack up this little friendship gathering and move along. Indians aren't welcome around decent folk." But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. The wind, which had been howling relentlessly for hours, began to calm. The snow that had been driving horizontally started to fall more gently. Through the clearing air, they could all see something that made everyone pause. In the distance, more lights were approaching. Not the harsh torches of another war party, but the warm glow of lanterns carried by families, settlers from the surrounding area, drawn by reports of the storm and concerned for their neighbors at the trading post. "Well, now," Morrison muttered, "looks like we're about to have ourselves a real gathering." The approaching settlers included women and children, elders and young men, all bundled against the cold, but moving with purpose through the improving weather. As they drew closer, their lantern light illuminated the scene. Tribal people and settlers standing together around gifts laid out in the snow, with a small girl at the center of it all. Garrett saw them coming, and his expression grew uglier. Perfect. Now we got witnesses to this Indian-loving foolishness. But when the settlers arrived, their reactions weren't what Garrett expected. The first to reach them was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose own granddaughter was about Lily May's age. "What's happening here?" she asked, looking around at the gathered people with curiosity rather than fear. "The little one saved our baby from the cold death," Ayana said suddenly, her English broken but understandable. She held up her infant, now warm and alert, in Lily May's blue blanket. She gave her covering so our son could live. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened as she looked from the baby to Lily May to the gifts arranged in the snow. "Land's sakes, child, you saved this little one's life." Lily May nodded shyly, suddenly overwhelmed by all the attention. But other settlers were arriving now, and word of what had happened was spreading quickly through the group. Instead of fear or anger, their faces showed something closer to wonder. "That's the most beautiful thing I've heard all winter," said another woman, her voice soft with emotion. A young father carrying his own small son stepped forward. "Takes real courage to give up your only warm covering for a stranger." Garrett saw his support evaporating before his eyes. These weren't hardened fighters looking for conflict. They were families, people who understood the value of kindness and the preciousness of children's lives. "You're all being fooled," he said desperately. "This is just Indian trickery. They're trying to make you soft so they can take advantage." But Takakota had been watching this entire exchange with growing understanding. He stepped forward and spoke directly to the gathered settlers. "Your child did something tonight that our people will remember for generations," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the calmer air. "She saw past the differences that divide us and acted from her heart. This is not trickery. This is the kind of spirit that could heal the wounds between our peoples." He gestured to his tribal members, who began to unpack more items from their horses. "We brought gifts not just for the child, but for all who shelter here. Food to share, medicines to heal, furs to keep families warm through the remaining winter." The settlers looked at each other in amazement. They had expected conflict, but instead found themselves witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the people they had been taught to fear. But Garrett wasn't finished. His face had turned red with fury, and his hand was now resting openly on his weapon. "This ends now," he growled. "I won't stand by and watch good white folks get poisoned by savage lies." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with the potential for violence hanging heavy in the air despite the calming storm. Because sometimes the greatest threat to hatred isn't opposition, but the simple power of human connection. And some people will do anything to prevent that connection from taking root. What happened next would be talked about for decades in settlements across the territory. As Garrett's hand moved toward his weapon, every person present understood that they stood at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but the future of relations between their communities. But it was Mrs. Patterson who acted first. The elderly woman stepped directly between Garrett and the tribal people, her weathered hands planted firmly on her hips. "Garrett Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped raise half the children in 3 counties. "You put that hand away right now. There's been enough violence in this land to last 10 lifetimes, and I won't see it started over a child's act of kindness." Other settlers began to move, not away from the confrontation, but closer to it. They formed a loose circle around Lily May and the tribal people, their lanterns creating a warm glow that pushed back both the darkness and the cold hatred that Garrett represented. "These people came in peace," said the young father, shifting his own child to his other arm. "They came to honor what our little girl did. If we can't respect that, what kind of people are we?" Garrett looked around desperately, seeking support among his men. But even they seemed uncertain now, faced with families, children, and elders rather than armed opponents. Their appetite for violence was fading. Takakota stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "I have lived through many seasons of conflict," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I have seen what hatred costs both our peoples. Tonight, a child showed us another way." He gestured to Lily May, who was watching everything with wide, serious eyes. She did not see an Indian baby or a white baby. She saw a child in need, and she acted from her heart. Perhaps it is time for the adults to learn from such wisdom. The tribal leader reached into his coat and withdrew something that made everyone gasp. A peace pipe, carved from white stone and decorated with intricate symbols. In our tradition, this pipe is used to seal agreements between peoples. Tonight, I offer to smoke it with any who would choose peace over conflict. Samuel found himself stepping forward before he fully realized what he was doing. "I'll smoke with you," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "My daughter showed more courage tonight than I've shown in years." One by one, other settlers stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, the young father, even Morrison emerged from his trading post to join them. Only Garrett and his men remained apart, isolated by their hatred. Takakota lit the pipe with ceremony and reverence, then passed it to Samuel. As the two men shared the sacred smoke, something profound shifted in the air around them. The storm had passed, the stars were beginning to appear, and for the first time in memory, two communities that had been divided by fear and misunderstanding found themselves united by the simple actions of a 6-year-old girl. Ayana approached Lily May and carefully wrapped the magnificent woven blanket around her shoulders. The child looked up at her with a smile that needed no translation, and Ayana smiled back, tears freezing on her cheeks. Garrett turned his horse and rode away into the night, his men following reluctantly. His hatred had found no purchase here, defeated not by force, but by the simple power of human decency. As the two communities began to share food and stories around a fire built from contributions of both peoples, Lily May sat wrapped in her new blanket, watching adults learn what she had always known, that when someone is cold, you give them warmth, and when someone shows kindness, you respond with kindness. The little blue blanket she had given away was returned to her that night, but she had gained something far more valuable. She had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the world, one heart at a time. And in the years that followed, when the story was told and retold, people would say that the peace between the communities began not with treaties or agreements, but with a 6-year-old girl who saw a freezing baby and chose love over fear. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and compassion collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe to Narrative Odyssey and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to Narrative Odyssey.